I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello, and welcome to the RANE Insights podcast series. Today, David Lawrence, founder and chief collaborative officer at RANE, sits down with Ken Yormark. Ken most recently was a partner and practice leader of the Forensic and Litigation Advisory Services practice for a top 25 accounting firm. Ken's experience spans more than 30 years as a subject matter expert in complex investigations and forensic and investigative services, focusing on formulating and implementing innovative strategies regarding forensic accounting and financial investigations.
Ken, it's always both a great honor and fun to catch up with you. And this is our first podcast, but obviously not the first time that we've worked together on a variety of assignments. So just by way of introduction for the audience, I thought it'd be helpful if you gave a bit of an overview of a very long and very well-respected career in the what I'll refer to as the forensic auditing and consulting world.
Sure. Thank you, David. And it's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you. I think today is going to be fun. So I started my career as an auditor at one of the big accounting firms. And quite frankly, I was really bad at it because I asked too many questions. I was always frustrated about doing the same thing that we did last year. And I was fortunate enough to discover a fraud very early in my career at one of our clients. And that really opened my eyes up to forensic accounting, financial investigations, at a time, quite frankly, when nobody knew what the heck that was. So that was about 35 years ago. And since that time, I've worked at several corporate investigations firms, a couple of advisory firms / consulting firms, and accounting firms. And I've always been doing forensic accounting, financial investigations. And just recently, as of January 1 of this year, I decided to open up my own shop. And, with 35 years of experience, I obviously know a lot of really good people, very capable professionals in the industry. So I've aligned myself with a lot of those people, and with that capability, I can do forensic accounting, we can do litigation support, data analytics, damage calculations, valuation work, asset searching, you name it, we can basically cover the area.
Okay. And I've always, while you've been in the private sector, I always view the opportunities not only to work with you, but quite frankly to learn from you as you're contributing very much a form of public service because of the questions you ask, the issues you highlight, and also some of the lessons from other events that you try to educate people about. And we are going to, I'm going to extract right now, Ken, a promise that we will do a separate podcast on the issue of forensic accounting and the art of diligence and asking the right questions. For those in the audience, I've shared with Ken sort of my take on the famous expression, it's the economy stupid, to say it's the accounting stupid, and why that is. Yeah, just central to diligence. And we're recording this at a particular inflection point in history where there are bank failures, there have been a number of failures in the crypto space, and also within the last year some significant blow-ups with publicly listed companies abroad. So Ken, to a conversation to be continued. So the reason we're speaking today is we're about to begin one of the great sporting events in the country, if not the world, the NCAA college basketball tournament. And I became recently aware of some of the great work you've done over the last couple of years, thinking about how best to preserve the integrity of the game, whether it's in basketball or football, baseball, soccer, aka football in the rest of the world, etc., and thinking long and hard about some of the issues that can arise around sports, in large part because of the what I'll refer to as the growth in the betting industry. Betting has always occurred in sports, and we'll get into maybe the history of some of the scandals that have occurred in the past. But certainly with the advent of various platforms and various apps, you can not only bet on legally on various sport events, but there are all sorts of prop bets that one can place on different aspects of these games. So maybe begin with the following, giving us just a bit of an introduction how you became interested in this space. And I'm going to put this under a broad umbrella because you and I have, obviously we've had many conversations about this, but the point being, how do you avoid a crisis? Do we have to wait for a crisis to occur before we respond? Are there certain things that we know historically, factually, as a matter of culture, as a matter of human behavior, that we have to be prepared for and assume can occur? And so what can we do ahead of the curve? So with that, Ken, maybe share with us your interest around the integrity of the sport.
Yeah, look, it's not just sports. I mean, obviously, I'm really interested in sports. I love to participate and I love to watch, and I think it's something that our country is incredibly embedded in. But I would tell you that it's not just sports; it's all industries where you have to be thinking about the controls, right, and how they should be put in place. And unfortunately, as you kind of alluded to, David, in many cases, the fixes don't come into play until something happens, right? An event takes place which causes people to look back and say, well, we have to go ahead and do something about this. I mean, the Silicon Valley Bank is a perfect example of that. I mean, we had lessened the rules over the regulators' requirements with these various banks. And now after one or two banks have collapsed, and we're seeing that the issues were there, well, the government is saying we have to strengthen the rules. Well, unfortunately, that's usually the common occurrence where an incident takes place and then the controls are put in. It's the scenario of if you don't know it's broken, why go ahead and fix it? Why spend the money if it doesn't need to be done? And I'm an advocate for preventive care in many cases, going in and looking at the process prior to the issues that could potentially be a problem, because it can be done in a much more effective fashion. It can be done in a much more cost-effective way, dramatically. But that doesn't necessarily tend to be the case in most industries. That's just the scenario that we live with for the most part. In talking about the way the world has built up this interest in betting. It's always been there, but it's always been something that's kind of been behind the scenes. We never saw it as out and open as we do today. If you watch any sporting event, in particular football, basketball, whatever, you've got all of these commercials now just pining to get you to sign up with these various different betting groups, and it's becoming a lot more commonplace. Now, there's always been a massive amount of money that's been bet on all of these different events. They talk about the Super Bowl and the billions of dollars, and March Madness. Every company has a pool, and all of these things have been going on, but it's in our face now. And we're starting to see this like perceived opportunity to make some big money, easy money. And I kind of go back to this old cliche of the fraud triangle. And if you're not familiar with the fraud triangle, there are three pieces to the puzzle. You've got this perceived opportunity, you've got an enhanced amount of pressure, and then you've got certain rationalization that goes on for committing what could potentially be a fraudulent activity, right? So you've got this situation where if one of those three things is taking place, there's a real strong possibility that somebody could potentially kind of jump in to the process. Now, it's not a question of a personality. I see it as more a circumstance. If the circumstances are aligned, then that bad activity might take place. And I equate it to something called the 20-60-20 rule. Quite frankly, some people look at it as a 10-80-10 rule. But it's really where you've got these 20% who are just the best people, the good people who will never ever do anything wrong. They would never even think about it. And then you've got 20% of the world who keep me in business, quite frankly, because they're always looking for an angle. They're always looking for the easy way out. They're always looking to potentially kind of beat the system. It's the 60% in the middle that, quite frankly, we have to try and control. Because if that 60% sees a reason to go ahead and take the leap and try and do something illegal, hopefully there is a control that's been put in place which will stop them from doing that. But there are times when circumstances for that 60% make it make it much more of a reason for them to jump in and do something. For example, the circumstances where a person might become jobless, or they have exorbitant medical bills, or they feel like they're being wronged, and they haven't gotten a bonus during the year and they want to get back at somebody, or they see that other people in their company are doing things that are not necessarily legal, and they say to themselves, well, why shouldn't I do it, right? Or there's just this inordinate amount of pressure that people feel, and maybe it's a survival mode. Maybe they can't put food on the table. All of those things will build up the process for somebody to go ahead and try and take a leap into that space to do something illegal and something fraudulent. So really, I go back to the whole scenario of controls, internal controls being such an important factor in this whole equation, because if somebody sees that there's a gap in their controls, they'll take a chance, and they'll check to see if that can be eluded. And if nobody says anything, all of a sudden they start to do something and they feel like they've kind of figured it all out, and it just builds and builds and builds. And then it becomes too late to turn around.
All right, so you're suggesting, more than suggesting, you are talking about the risks of human behavior and
Absolutely.
and temptation, etc. And what I'm hearing you discuss is that when you think about the ability to make money or influence markets, and we see this all the time. I don't think there will ever be a shortage of insider trading cases for the SEC to pursue, unless, of course, somebody changes the law and legalizes insider trading. And we have seen, in the accounting world, all sorts of games that are played with numbers, with the valuations that are assigned, with related party transactions, with various revenue recognition tricks, with round trip trading and things like that. And what I'm hearing you say, and over the course of your 30-year career, is basically you've seen what I refer to as the spectrum of human behavior manifests itself to take advantage of what I'll refer to as perceived financial opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely the case. And I've seen it in all different shapes and sizes. And your insider trading point is an interesting one, where I did a little bit of research before we had our conversation today, and the SEC comes out with their numbers every year on what has actually taken place and what kind of cases they've been working on. And they had 43 cases relating to insider trading, relating to 93 individuals in 2022. And that's about 10% of the cases that the SEC brought last year. Those are pretty typical numbers. But interestingly enough, they really are starting to become more technically savvy in the way that they're looking at these cases, and they're using advanced analytics to basically go in and spot anomalies, something that we, quite frankly, have been doing for a long time. The SEC is now really, gone into a hyper mode with this. So they're going to start to see a lot more insider trading cases as a result of those types of investigative techniques that they're able to use with broad amounts of data. So we should see that rise over the course of the next few years. And they're looking at cases that are not necessarily huge. They could be smaller cases as well as very large ones.
And then that kind of leads into what piqued my interest about some of the current work you're doing around human behavior and where some vulnerabilities or exposures might exist. So we now have just incredible amounts of money that are wagered on a variety of things, including the markets. And you have, fortunately, at least here in the U.S., there's been an incredible job done, both at the professional level and I'd say the collegiate level, in keeping sports as a clean activity where it hasn't been compromised, it hasn't been corrupted, fraud has not been committed, and at least nothing that's been exposed recently. And we do know the leagues spend a lot of money and have some incredibly talented people, including people out of the law enforcement community, who are watching this market and are being even more acutely aware because of the burgeoning legalized gambling and the types of bets that can be placed and who's making odds and who's making predictions. But it is now everywhere, Ken. And what I heard you say, and that's what, again, piqued my interest to do a podcast with you, is you believe that the various displays of human behavior that you've seen over your 30 years, that this environment is one that is particularly ripe with temptation to get an edge, to potentially take advantage of the large amounts of money that are at stake. And maybe a good place to begin is, I know you've studied the history of sports and some of the ways in which people have been compromised, whether it's in basketball, whether it's in tennis, etc. Something that we were speaking about before the podcast, which is it has been proposed by the WWE to legalize betting on these scripted matches, and to adopt almost like an Oscar Academy Awards type platform where someone from E&Y or KPMG or whatever, only that person will know the results, and thereby the integrity of the sport is protected and stuff. But in any event, why don't we start with a little bit of history, because I know you've come to this particular moment and with a great deal of thought.
I will get to the history in a second, but I have to comment on the World Wrestling scenario. So when I first heard about it, I kind of shook my head. I couldn't believe it, because we all know these are scripted matches, as you mentioned. I went back and did a little bit of research, and they're trying to do this on a state-by-state basis, and not all states are obviously agreeing to this. But one of the things that they're saying is, well, they'll protect the knowledge because an accounting firm will only know the results, and the wrestlers won't be told the end result until a few hours before the event. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what are they going to do? Sequester the wrestlers for 4 or 5 hours when they know? What about the trainers? What about their friends? What are they going to do to protect themselves about not knowing this? I mean, the scenario kind of blows my mind, to be honest with you. So it's going to be fascinating to watch how that all develops, and actually if it comes to fruition. Because then they're saying, well, the next thing we'll be betting on the results of TV shows, like which person in the TV show is going to get killed off first. So it could go anywhere. To go back to history, I know one you like to talk about is City College back in the 50s. That's before my time, but
Mine as well, Ken, just to be clear. Okay, mine as well. Okay.
but you could go back to Pete Rose. Betting on games, he never said or admitted that he bet on his own games, but he bet on professional baseball games. Boston College, there was a point shaving event back in 78 and 79, and then Tulane had a similar situation back in 1984 and 85. So, I mean, it's not like it hasn't happened before. And then you could talk about soccer. If you go back and look at the details behind soccer, there are multiple storylines where games have been fixed in the world of soccer. And then there's the one that everybody kind of knows is the NBA referee, Tim Donaghy, who about 15 years ago, he was betting on games and supposedly was giving information to, organized crime on different issues relating to the game. So all of those events are real scenarios, and it's interesting because some of this has resulted in certain organizations doing more than other organizations to kind of review their product, review who their referees are, review the analysis that goes on for each game, and kind of see how these decisions are made. I don't know if it's being done in all sports, but it will be interesting to develop a better understanding as I move forward with this in trying to find out what all leagues are actually doing in connection with this kind of a risk, because I do see the risk expanding in a dramatic way. And I mean, if you talk about rationalization, I mean, a referee that's making, a small amount of money who's working a game side by side with people who are making multi-million dollars per year, hard to justify that type of a scenario. Referees in various different sports have a lot of control. And they can dictate a lot of the storylines that take place within those games, which ultimately can result in a change in the scoring, change in who wins, but not just that. Incidental issues relating to those games. For example, who's going to make the first free throw? Who's going to score the first touchdown? What the length of the national anthem is going to be. All of these things are potentially incidental actions that take place within a game where, somebody might say to themselves, well, it's not such a big deal if I switch, if I bet on something that is insignificant to the end game of the storyline. I was out in Las Vegas one year, and I happened to be there during March Madness, and I went into one of these casinos to watch some of the games, and it was really fascinating to listen to the response from the crowd, because the crowd was cheering for the most incidental moments in the game. And I realized that people were betting on who was going to make the first three and who was going to get fouled, who was going to be fouled first. I mean, all of these inconsequential pieces of the storyline were being bet on. It was incredible.
So I want to make sure that the audience hears this, because these are points that you were very specific about. This is not a podcast where Ken is saying these are the things going on. This is a podcast to give context that human behavior repeats itself. I told Ken that I love to quote scripture in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. And what I'm hearing you say, Ken, is that as more and more money gets bet, is available to be gambled with, and as more and more action is taken with all sorts of bets, the temptations now more than ever are present. And there are a number of things within, and I know the leagues that we have some familiarity with, doing a tremendous job both in terms of surveillance and training and using technology to look at games and understand what's going on, and also to coordinate with law enforcement. But what I'm hearing you say is that invariably with the greater amounts of money that can be gambled, and with the greater variety of ways that people can bet, similarly the temptations and the risk will also rise, maybe not exponentially, but certainly in somewhat lockstep.
Yeah, look, I would hope, David, that all of these leagues, whether it's college or professional, would realize that the risk is increasing on a daily basis. And as a result of that, they should be looking at how they are putting in their controls to prevent this from taking place, so that they don't get into a situation where they have something ugly that happens and they have to go back in and create a whole new process under chaotic circumstances. That's not the way you want this to work. From a PR perspective, it would be a nightmare, obviously. And if you can show the public that you're actually doing something to make sure that the game is clean, I think that's really an important thing for people to understand.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because there are various stakeholders in what's happening. First of all, you have governments now that are participating in the revenues of legalized gambling. You have the owners, obviously the teams, the terrific leadership of the leagues are very important stakeholders. You have the public that is watching these events, you have the public that's betting on these events, and you obviously have elected officials and regulators who are responsible for overseeing this. And so with the myriad of stakeholders here, and if I can offer this proposition, this is a situation where we're all sort of in this together, to be focused on maintaining the integrity of the game. What are some of the things that you're thinking about, or maybe phrased differently, Ken, what's keeping you up at night a bit around the current environment?
Temptation. I think that the money that's involved is so vast that there's an enormous amount of temptation to take the plunge, to do something that might be illegal. And I think that you have to, again, put controls in place to kind of keep people in line, to know that somebody's watching, somebody's monitoring the process, so that they don't take that step. I think that it's such a part of our culture today. The betting aspect is there for everybody. And yeah, you have to be 18 years old, but I'm sure there are plenty of kids that are doing it that are a lot younger than that, who are using fake IDs. And so I think that it's a growing problem that needs to be monitored before we have a really ugly situation.
So Ken, wearing the forensic hat that you've always wore, I know that you have different approaches to this type of issue, and it's no different than when you're auditing a public company or a private company for that matter, or you're involved in internal investigation. You're thinking about records, you're thinking about questions that need to be asked, you're thinking about what's out there in open source and public records and data, what's out there in social media. How are you thinking about, just from a pragmatic and practical standpoint, types of ways and the types of information that can be helpful here.
Sure. So, in many cases, what we are looking at companies is the controls that the company has in place that basically monitor the company as an overall activity, right? Um, and really, what we're talking about here is taking this down one level further, where we're really focusing on the individuals. And this could be at companies, this could be at leagues, this could be anywhere, where you're really going in and kind of looking at individuals who potentially have an opportunity within their own organization to do something that could potentially be illegal if they had a reason to do so. And so the bottom line is you want to look at the history of that individual. You want to look at their current status from an economic perspective, from a psychological perspective. You want to be able to look at them and say, well, is this a person who could potentially be swayed or convinced to do something illegal? Do they have certain of the key components that would drive them to become one of those individuals? And basically, what you're doing is you're risk ranking your employees.
And let's talk about, this is risk ranking employees, but very often corporations, no less professional sports leagues, do background checks and diligence on people. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know this is an area you've thought a great deal about.
Yeah, it kind of goes beyond the level of doing a background check. Really, what I envision is asking the individual some very significant questions, hard questions, and making sure that they are being open and honest about their situation. Whether they've been bankrupt before, whether they have any tax issues, what their level of debt is, and really getting the individuals to be a part of the process, so they understand that basically what you're doing is you're asking them some very hard questions, some personal questions, which go beyond what you would get in a background check. And you want to see what kind of information you're being provided. And ultimately, you're going to go back and check that information to verify and see that that person is being upfront with you. These can be very difficult questions. How much debt do you have? How many houses do you own? Have you ever been divorced? Have you ever gone bankrupt? Do you have any issues that you're dealing with the tax authorities? All of these issues are the kinds of things that could potentially put somebody in a position where they have an inordinate amount of pressure on them, where if they were to be given an opportunity, they might rationalize that it's okay to do something that's not necessarily legal. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you're risk ranking those employees. And the benefit, quite frankly, is that they know this is being done. They're a part of the process. So that becomes a preventive measure in itself.
All right, and what I'd like to do is just sort of put a pin in this, because what you're saying here is that there are certain, again, we're talking about human behavior, there are certain events and incidents in people's lives that might make them more susceptible or more vulnerable or more inclined, okay?
Absolutely. And it goes back to what I said earlier, with the pressure that people are under. And quite frankly, in today's day and age, there are a lot of people that are under an inordinate amount of pressure. And then the whole rationalization scenario, like, well, somebody else is doing it, so why can't I do it? Or that person's making 20 times more money than I am, why shouldn't I be able to get a piece of the pie? So those are all the kind of the key pieces of the puzzle that would potentially make somebody do something which is illegal. And then ultimately, as I said earlier, you want to try and squelch that opportunity by having the right controls in place.
And you're drawing, just to be clear, Ken, basically what you're doing is you're drawing upon your experience 30 years as a forensic auditor, both in terms of auditing companies, but also responding to reports of fraud and doing internal investigation. These are sort of the common denominators that you have seen that can cause an issue.
Yes, and just so I hate the term forensic auditor, David. Um, the term audit is really, most audits are done in a very checklist approach, where they literally have 27 different things that they have to do, and they go down that checklist, and once they're done with those 27 things, they sign off and they're done. When we get involved, we don't really have a checklist. We kind of work off a blank palette, and based on the information that we get, based on the findings that we see, based on the documentation that we're able to kind of dig up, we move in various different directions. We don't really have a checklist. So it's much more creative than an audit. Let's just
Right, okay, and I'm going to push back a little bit because I've always held auditors in the highest regard, and I've never, the good ones that I've had a chance to work with, and very knowledgeable, sophisticated, and caring people, have never worked off a checklist. Yes, they have a checklist, but that doesn't define the work that they do.
I would
It's sort
agree
of
with that.
a starting point, not an end point. Okay, so all right. But point taken. Let me pull a little bit from my own experience, both when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office and I was asked to speak to industry groups, but also because of the opportunity I had at Goldman Sachs. And I'll just draw about the financial industry. We talked about insider trading. What I will say about the very nature of the financial industry and investment banks in particular is that they hire incredibly talented people and very driven people and very ambitious people. And they often don't necessarily end up in finance. They go off to do other things, but many people do stay. But one of the immediate things that happens, and institutions talk to people about this, they talk about insider trading rules and what people can do and can't do. But it's very tough to prepare people for the temptation of being in possession, being aware of information that will move a market, and move a market in a very material and significant way, or the easy money that can be made. And I say that because, again, there's never a shortage in the SEC or the FBI's pipeline around insider trading cases. And it doesn't matter how many enforcement actions occur, the issue may die down for a little while, but then it comes back. It's one of the great recurring waves in enforcement analogs. And one of the things that I try to convey to people, and I think there are applications, one of the things I try to impart to, particularly to young people, is that they will be exposed to these temptations. And let me give you the self-interested reason why you must not succumb. The types of stories about people that walked and talked and looked like them once upon a time, whose lives ended up in ruins. The sophistication of law enforcement in monitoring markets and sort of identifying and recognizing, we'll call it, trading activities and behavior that doesn't fit a common pattern, outliers and how it gets picked up. The fact that I don't care how many offshore entities or people you share information with, this is not an activity, a crime that you can commit by yourself, okay? Because it's just impossible. You can't trade on insider information without somebody else being on the other side and possibly detecting. And also the lag period of time that you may think you get away with something and be tempted to do it again and again and again, but that, very often it's a number of years later when the FBI or the SEC knock on your door. So as a matter of self-interest, as a matter of self-preservation, there will be many temptations and all sorts of ways that you think you can accomplish this, but it just doesn't work out from a cost-benefit basis. The risks are far too high, and the consequences are very, very dire. And I've had people many years later actually say to me that that's what they remembered most. Not the rules of the road, not why something was illegal, but this notion of self-interest. And Ken, you and I, before this podcast, we talked about, particularly for younger people, where the temptations can come from. And there's a very, very interesting, we'll call it personal narrative, involving one of the most talented individuals to play basketball, Connie Hawkins, who was basically, I'll use the word seduced into shaving points, and I think also sharing information that did not impact the ultimate outcome of the game, but nonetheless provided information, the basis for people to take advantage in a betting market. And Mr. Hawkins, who fortunately was, came back to the league, and I believe he was elected to the Hall of Fame, and as someone who otherwise had an extraordinary life and career, did fall prey to this. And so the points you're making about the degree of temptations and rationalizations, I think, is a very, very important point. But also the ability to educate people about their own self-interest and what can happen and how things are detected, and the way government investigations often are built with cooperators. I think it's a significant part of that lesson, and part of the, I'll call it one of the cornerstones perhaps of preventing what you've outlined is almost inevitable human behavior.
Yeah, and just for those who don't know, Connie Hawkins was Julius Erving before Julius Erving was Julius Erving. And I remember reading a book when I was, probably in like 7th grade or something, called Foul, Foul. If you ever want to read a cool book about Connie Hawkins, it's probably out there someplace. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that I worry about is that, with all these prop bets that can be done in all these different leagues, there are so many things that won't really ultimately influence the end of the game and the result of the game, which kind of is a rationalization for some of these people where, I'm not really hurting my teammates, I'm not really hurting anybody, but I can go ahead and do that. And no one's going to get hurt. And just to touch on the insider trading scenario, I mean, the SEC has all this focus on insider trading with securities, but if you think about insider trading from the sports world's perspective, I mean, what if a referee or an assistant coach knew that one of the players went out the night before and was really, really sick that day and wasn't going to play that well, or they just knew about an injury that was hindering somebody that wasn't really well known in the league. All of these little incidents could be considered insider trading if you were providing that information to somebody who was ultimately going to make a bet based on that.
Ken, I want to, it's a great analogy. I want to pick up on the other theme that around information and we'll call it the natural tendencies of human behavior. And you saw this implicitly with Pete Rose. Mr. Rose, probably one of the most talented baseball players in the history of the game, and just a very unique individual. One can read between the lines that any bets that he did make, there was a rationalization. I am not betting on my own team. I'm not altering the outcome as a manager. This is just, innocuous information, and my bets have nothing to do with, the integrity of my job, etc. And really, the point you have made, I think, which is very important, is that the nature of human behavior is that one can easily rationalize no harm, no foul, when in fact, the law will look at it differently, the sports leagues will look at it differently, the public will look at it differently, and obviously, the political circles will look at it differently. And when these scandals do break, it takes a long time to recover. And just from what I do know of how the NBA, and I think it was under Commissioner Stern at the time, who was passed away, they quickly got on top when they realized they had a problem with one of their referees. And there were obviously things that they put in place to incorporate the acquired wisdom and acquired lessons of that. And what I'm hearing from you is that we have to stay proactive, whether you're running a company or a sports league or a betting platform, or obviously Las Vegas is always attuned to people who might have inside information, all right? And they do. I do know the established, sort of betting platforms coming out of Vegas work closely with law enforcement around this. And so the points you're making, I think, are not only I won't call them prescient, but it does give a unique view, or an important view, of history and what we have to be mindful of, because unlike mutual funds, past performance often is predictive of future returns.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's healthy for companies, to do what I would call a health check, right? Kick the tires, whether it's a sports league or a company, to basically examine how they monitor these kinds of potential issues, and put together preventive measures so that it doesn't happen to them in the future.
Just for the audience, Ken is running an NCAA pool where the entrance fee is $1,000. Okay.
Not true.
Not true. Okay. All right. Anyway, Ken, great insights, and I know you're working on a number of what I'll refer to as products, and I'll refer to them as forensic models to be made available. And thank you, by the way, for giving me the opportunity to contribute a bit to that effort, and look forward to sharing that with the audience in the coming months. But again, thanks for the leadership, thanks for the thoughtfulness, and thanks for spending some time.
It's always a pleasure, David. You have a great afternoon.
You can learn how geopolitical events could affect your business with RANE Intelligence Briefs. Our flagship risk intelligence products provide clients with access to the insights and analyses they need to make more informed decisions and drive better risk management outcomes, all for a fraction of the cost you pay yourself. Sign up at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emma Kami. Thanks for listening.